in the Northern Hemisphere, winter is truly starting to bite. So, trails are muddy and crusty, and that results in, well, quite bogging bikes. But how do you get your bike back to, well, box fresh? Here's how. Okay, how are we going to clean a bike? Well, first we're probably going to need some water, be that in a hose or a bucket or with a pressure washer. Then you're going to need some brushes. There's some really good ones out there on the market that do different things for different parts of your bike. Then you'll also need some cleaner, some degreaser, and to make your bike almost new again, you'll need some lube. We'll run through why and where you need all those parts later. As you can see, this process is, as with many bike tasks, easier with a stand. It's not essential, but it is a lot simpler. Right, the first task we're going to do is rinse the whole bike down just with clean water. We're just trying to soften up that crud. Okay, here goes. Oh, whoa. Just before you go hog wild with the jet wash, just be careful. Why? Well, there's sensitive bearings in there. We chatted to a couple of different brands about how to clean your bike, which might sound really obvious, but there's a lot of sensitive bearings. Even well-sealed bearings just have simple rubber seals. So going hog wild with a really high-pressure jet wash could damage them. It could wash out some of the grease and instead replace it with, well, crusty brown water and grit, which will eat through bearings in extra quick time. So be gentle with the jet wash. If anything, just use a hose and use a bit more effort with some brushes. Okay, I'm standing fairly far back because I just want to soften up all the stuff that's dried, all the crusty bits. So do the wheels, move them around a bit, make sure you get the bit that's underneath, do the cassette. We're just low pressure, just making sure that everything's damp. We're not trying to blast stuff off because we're going to let the cleaner do that for us. Don't forget to do the other side of the bike. As a race mechanic, I've done that. Depending on how crusty your bike is and where that muck is, well, you'll have to pay more attention and pre-rinse a little bit more. So on this bike, we've got quite a bit of crud and a bit of grass in here. So we'll try and rinse a little bit, but what I don't want to do is use the pressure of the hose to try and blast that out because, well, I could damage those bearings. So I'm just going to try and rinse it again. Might have to use mechanical aids to help get rid of some of that mud. With most of the mud removed, now it's time to break out the bike cleaner. And I know often people go, bike cleaner, you could use car cleaners, you could use other stuff to clean it. And you can, but bike cleaners are dedicated for bikes and they're designed around the dedicated seals that we have on bikes, the suspension systems that we have on bikes, the tyres. Lots of automotive products can be really, really harsh because they're designed to work really quickly and on something, well, really big and burly, like a car. Think of how big brake pads are on your car versus how big the brake pads are on your bike. There's a big difference. That's why it's really important to use a bike cleaner. Right, let's get spraying. Now, with the cleaner working its magic on that ingrained mud, we can get stuck into the tyres. Now, I know some of you are thinking, why are we starting to clean wheels? That seems out of order. Bear with me. It is logical, promise. And this is from experience, because as soon as you clean the frame, you'll start to clean the wheels afterwards, potentially. And then as you rotate them, they flick mud everywhere and you have to start again. So start with the crustiest bits of your bike first, which is often the wheels and tyres. So dedicated brush, get stuck into them. Okay, we've cleaned off the wheels, we've cleaned off the tyres. The next step is drivetrain. Okay, you might be again thinking, Owen, you're doing this out of order. This is all mixed up, but there is logic again. The next dirtiest place after your wheels and tyres is your drivetrain. And as you're cleaning this, you're going to spread muck and degreased lube all over the rest of the frame and you clean it. So we want to save the last bit of the cleaning to clean that off. So next is drivetrain. Now, depending on what lube you've used on your chain, and thus will spread all over your drivetrain, you're going to have to use probably different degreasers. P2's has got a really nice foaming degreaser and it works really well with their chain lubes. It's been designed to work together. But if you've used another lube, maybe a wax-based one or something really thick and claggy, you might have to use something a bit gnarlier. So just be really careful when you're spraying those gnarlier, burlier degreasers because they can affect seals and other parts of your bike. Probably if you're using those harsher lubes and harsher chemicals to clean stuff, maybe take your chain off to give it a really good deep clean. With the degreaser sprayed on, we can leave it to sit there a little bit, but it does need agitating. A brush is very handy for this. Before we get stuck in and spray muck everywhere, what I tend to do is shift down to the smallest cog on your cassette, just because it means that you're spraying less around, and also it's easier to get in there with a brush and just work off that crud. The bike's still got some mud clinging on, so we're going to reapply in some of those over muddy areas. And that's not to do with the cleaner, it's more to do with the type of mud and the frame construction in terms of how it's sticking in there. So we'll just reapply. Then we're going to brush our way down the bike, and we're going to go down the bike to the bottom because, well, if we start at the bottom, we start cleaning and it gets all clean, and then we start trying to clean the upper part of the bike, well, all that mud and water is just going to rinse down. So start from the top and then work our way down. You might be wondering why we're using different brushes. Some of you will have already done the maths on why. Well, this chain one is going to be covered in, well, a bit of lube and a bit of degreaser. So if we start spreading that all over the bike, it's not stellar. Likewise with a tyre one, if it's just going to be covered in mud and crust, well, it's good just to keep it that way. So we're going to have different brushes for different parts of the frame. This one's going to pick up grit, and we don't want to rub that on the frame because it could scratch it. This one's going to have lube and degreaser, which also we don't want to rub on the frame. We need different brushes for the rest of the bike. So we're going to have a bog brush for the frame. This is the brush here, that's my hair. This one will be great pretty much all over the bike, but for those hard to reach areas and those sensitive fork seals, a brush like this with a very soft tip is ideal. Bike is really quite muddy, and thus the brush is really quite muddy too. So periodically, as you're working your way through the bike, top to bottom, remember, do rinse off the brush because you don't want to just keep spreading muddy water all over your bike. Do be really careful around fork seals. This garter seal on here with this little spring, they're really good, but they're not super tight, and that's to minimise any stiction in the fork. But it also means that you have to be very gentle around them, so don't just prod it with a stiff brush, and also don't point blank jet wash. Why? Because, well, you'll fill your internals with grit and probably water, and it will bring around that annual service, or probably regular service, around even sooner, which means your fork will be more expensive to get serviced. With all the cleaning done, now it's time for a final rinse down. If you're like me, you'll probably spot somewhere where you haven't cleaned, so just take your time and make sure that the whole bike is clean. Just especially if you're working on a stand, you sometimes might miss the other side. Obviously, I've never ever done that. Time for a rinse. Time now to dry your bike down. It does make a difference, not just to spot the bits that you haven't really cleaned, but also to take off all that excess water. Okay, we've dried down the bike. We've used a microfibre cloth to do that because, well, they're absorbent and reusable, so you can wash them. What I tend to do is start with a sort of slightly crustier one first and then work my way to a really clean one. Obviously, parts that might be a bit dirtier, like tyres and rims, use the dirty cloth for, but make sure that you keep one cloth aside for your chain and drivetrain because we need to clean it really well. We degreased it. Now we need to wipe off any excess degreaser and make sure it's really dry from the rinse. With a drivetrain nice and dry, it's now time to lube it up. We've done lots of videos on how to lube your chain, and it depends really on what lube you're going to use. We're going to use the Link Lube All Condition, so an all-weather lube, but if you're using a wax-based chain lube, well, you'll have to use a slightly different process. But for this stuff, we want to apply a little drop on each of the rollers and then wipe off any excess. I find it easier to shift down into the smallest sprocket and then just drip on the lower section of the chain from the rear derailleur forwards. And we just work the chain around, just one small drip on each of those links. We've washed and rinsed the bike. And that means that some parts will need a little top up of lubricant, and we need to disperse the water that may be in there. And brake levers often have a little linkage inside them, so it's a good example of where to use it. Now, do use any of these sprays kind of as minimal as possible, and make sure that you kind of mask the area off so you're not going to get any overspray anywhere that you don't want it. So just line it all up and make sure that it's just the tiniest of sprays. There we go. All good. Extra bonus point is to add some Protect and Shine. It's a silicone type spray which you can spray onto the frame or onto your forks. Just be careful to mask off any braking areas because, well, it's really slippery and shiny. So it helps the mud drip off, but also it may affect your braking. But let's apply. Okay, we are in the Northern Hemisphere, as mentioned, so whilst this bike is nicely washed, rinsed, re-washed again, lubed, dried, lubed again, and is now almost box fresh again, I know that the next ride will be in a state all over again. But what tips have you got for getting your crusty, muddy bike back to being box fresh again?